In the deep forests, where the night gloom seems almost a tangible substance, thousands of people froze in anticipation of a single, invisible signal. In each one's hands was not just cold metal and briquettes of chemical mixture, but the fate of a huge front, stretching for hundreds of kilometers to the east. In this second, the silence becomes almost unbearable. It presses on the shoulders more heavily than the weighty marching gear. A small match flame or a quiet click of an igniter separates the accustomed forest calm from the moment that will forever change the course of history in this part of the planet. This is the 19th of September, 1943. The night when the very concept of the rear ceased to exist for one of the world's most powerful armies. None of those lying in the wet grass near the railway embankments of Belarus, Smolensk region, or Ukraine could see the big picture. Each saw only his narrow section of the railway track, illuminated by the dim light of the moon or a passing patrol. But if someone could rise to an unattainable height and look at the occupied territories from above, they would see something incredible. As if by the wave of an invisible conductor's baton, a huge territory which seemed subdued and obedient prepared to unleash a single, deafening accord. This was not a chaotic flash of anger. It was a mathematically precise symphony of destruction, which went down in history under a code name full of grim irony and grandeur. Quote, Zero. To understand why this moment became a turning point, it is necessary to step back and look at the giant chessboard of the Eastern Front that autumn. Events unfolded with relentless speed. After the turning point at the Kursk Bulge, the strategic initiative passed into the hands of the Soviet command, and German troops began a difficult, exhausting retreat to the Dnieper River. German strategists placed their last hopes on this water barrier. The Dnieper, wide and full-flowing, was to become an insurmountable wall, the very underscore, quote, underscore, one underscore, against which the advancing Soviet armies would break. The plan of the German command was logical and simple. Gain time, entrench on the high right bank, bring up reserves from deep within Europe, and turn the war into a positional confrontation, exhausting the enemy's resources. The success of this plan depended on one critical variable: speed. The speed of transferring divisions, tanks, artillery, and even more importantly, ammunition and fuel. An army is a giant mechanism that devours thousands of tons of resources daily. If the arteries feeding this organism are cut, it will begin to weaken, suffocate, and ultimately lose its ability to resist. These arteries were the railways. The steel threads connecting Berlin with the front were the only way to ensure an uninterrupted supply for millions of soldiers. Road transport, in the conditions of autumn mud, could not cope with such volumes. The railway was the life of the Wehrmacht, its circulatory system. And it was precisely this system that it was decided to strike with such force as to cause complete paralysis. The idea of the operation was born not in forest dugouts, but in the offices of the central staff of the partisan movement in Moscow. The staff was led by Panteleimon Ponomarenko, a man with a unique mindset who understood that partisan warfare had outgrown the stage of scattered attacks. He saw in partisan detachments not just avengers, but a regular army operating in the enemy's rear. The idea was audacious. Instead of attacking guarded echelons, which could shoot back and required large forces to destroy, it was necessary to attack the infrastructure itself. A rail cannot shoot back. A rail will not call for reinforcements. But if thousands of rails are destroyed simultaneously over a huge area, repair crews simply physically will not be able to cope with the volume of work. Preparation for this grand operation required logistics comparable to preparing a large-scale frontal offensive. But the difficulty lay in the fact that the army that was to go into battle was behind the front line, deep in the enemy's rear. Communication relied on fragile radio bridges and risky flights by night aviation. It was necessary not only to transmit the order, but also to supply tens of thousands of fighters with explosives. Tons of TNT, Bickford fuses, and detonator caps were transported across the front line by planes, parachuted into designated squares of forest areas. This was a titanic effort, hidden from prying eyes. Every error in coordinates, every intercepted radio signal could cost the success of the entire operation. The external, visible layer of the conflict in those days represented a confrontation between two colossal systems of organization. On one side was German meticulousness, a communications security system honed over years. The Germans perfectly understood the vulnerability of their supply routes. Forests were cleared for hundreds of meters along the railways, exclusion zones were created, armored trains patrolled, and fortified bunkers were erected every kilometer. It seemed that not even a mouse could slip through unnoticed. On the other side was the Soviet system of coordinating disparate forces, the ability to unite the actions of 193 partisan brigades into a single fist. This was over 120,000 people, scattered over a vast territory from Karelia to Crimea, but with the main focus on the Belarusian direction. However, behind the dry figures and strategic maps lay a second, far more dramatic layer, the human one. The internal conflict of each participant in this drama was stretched to its limit. Imagine the state of a partisan detachment commander who received an order. He knows that his people are exhausted, that food supplies are running out, that enemy punitive expeditions are tightening the ring around the camp. And yet, he must lead his fighters from the relative safety of the forest thicket directly to the most guarded area, to the railway. Every outing to the railway was a lottery. People went on missions understanding that they might not return. Fear was a constant companion, but it was suppressed by a sense of duty and the understanding that there, on the Dnieper, their comrades from the regular army were awaiting help. For German soldiers guarding communications, this war turned into a psychological nightmare. They were accustomed to fighting a visible enemy, but here the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The forest, which during the day seemed just part of the landscape, turned into a living, hostile creature at night. The constant sense of danger, the inability to relax for a second, the understanding that any bush could hide an observer, exhausted the nervous system more than open combat. German railway workers, locomotive drivers, and repairmen lived in a state of permanent stress. They called these places Green Hell, and this name was not an exaggeration. A train ride from Minsk towards the front became Russian roulette. But there was also a third, deepest layer of this conflict, the ideological, philosophical one. Operation Concert became a clash of two concepts of space ownership. The German war machine was built on controlling lines and nodes. They owned cities and roads, believing that this was enough to control the country. Partisan strategy, on the contrary, relied on controlling the space between the lines. It was a war of chaos against order, flexibility against rigidity. The Germans tried to impose their structure on the chaotic nature of war, to force it into train schedules and supply charts. The partisans, however, used chaos itself as a weapon, turning German order into their main vulnerability. The rail, a symbol of industrial civilization and progress, in this conflict became a symbol of occupation, a chain binding the land. The destruction of the rail acquired the symbolic meaning of liberation, of breaking chains. And so, the moment of transformation arrived. The plan was perfect on paper, but reality introduced its harsh adjustments, creating an unexpected plot twist. The weather, that eternal and unpredictable participant in all wars, played its part. A sharp deterioration of meteorological conditions in September meant that aviation could not deliver the planned volume of explosives. Instead of hundreds of tons needed for total destruction, the partisans received only a fraction of the cargo. It seemed the operation was on the verge of collapse. How to blow up thousands of rails without TNT? Logic suggested canceling or postponing the action, but it was precisely here that the flexibility and inventiveness that distinguished the partisan movement manifested itself. The order from the center was not canceled, it was adapted. In the headquarters of brigades and detachments, a frantic search for solutions began. If there were no factory explosives, they had to procure them themselves. A massive hunt for unexploded aerial bombs and shells left on the battlefields of previous years began. Partisan craftsmen, risking their lives, melted TNT from old ammunition, creating homemade mines. This forced improvisation not only did not stop the operation, but also gave it an even more ferocious character. People understood, if there's no TNT, we'll tear up the rails mechanically, unscrew joints, destroy embankments by hand. The deficit of resources was compensated by an excess of will and ingenuity. The culmination arrived on the night of September 19th and continued in the following weeks, merging into a single continuous stream of events. At the appointed hour, the night silence over the occupied territories was broken by thousands of explosions. It truly resembled a concert, eerie and majestic. Explosions thundered from the borders of Estonia to the steppes of Ukraine. The effect was stunning. The German security system, designed to repel local attacks, proved powerless against the omnipresence of the strike. It's impossible to place a guard at every rail along thousands of kilometers. On the very first night, about 15,000 rails were blown up. But this was only the beginning. The operation did not end with a single strike. It continued methodically and ruthlessly until the end of October. Partisans went out to the night after night. The German command was in a state of shock. The capacity of railways fell by 35 to 40%. Entire divisions rushing to the Dnieper got stuck halfway. Tanks, so necessary at the front, stood on platforms somewhere in the Belarusian forests. Echelons with ammunition were driven into dead ends. A logistical collapse became a reality. Imagine a German general waiting for reinforcements to close a breakthrough of Soviet tanks at a bridgehead beyond the Dnieper. He is reported. The echelon has departed, but it stopped 200 kilometers from the front. The tracks are destroyed. Repair crews can't cope. There aren't enough rails for replacement. The general shouts, demands, threatens, but he is powerless. Iron and machinery are defeated not by other iron, but by the coordinated will of people in the forests. The time gained by the partisans became a golden resource for the Red Army. While the Wehrmacht tried to restore its arteries, Soviet troops forced the Dnieper, captured and expanded bridgeheads, liberated Kiev. The significance of this operation extended far beyond the dry military statistics of destroyed echelons. It showed a new level of interaction between the front and the rear. It was a resonance whose echo is still heard in military academies around the world. Operation Concert demonstrated that resistance in occupied territory can be not just a pinprick, but a strategic factor capable of deciding the fate of entire campaigns. The The lessons of those days are still relevant today when we talk about hybrid conflicts and the vulnerability of logistics chains. The modern world, entangled in communication networks, is even more dependent on their integrity than the world of the 1940s. The consciousness of the population in the occupied territories also underwent a transformation. The rumble of nightly explosions was better news to them than any radio reports. It was the sound of hope, a signal that the occupiers were not complete masters of the situation, that their power was temporary and shaky. The psychological effect of the operation was colossal. The feeling of helplessness was replaced by a sense of involvement in the great cause of liberation. Every blown-up rail brought closer the return of their own. When the final chords of the concert faded by early November, the picture of the war had irreversibly changed. The Battle of the Dnieper was won by Soviet troops, and the partisans' contribution to this victory was invaluable. German defenses on the Eastern Wall collapsed not only under frontal assaults, but also because their foundation had been undermined from within. Thousands of tons of undelivered cargo, hundreds of echelons that did not arrive on time, these were thousands of saved lives of Soviet soldiers who did not have to storm fully manned German positions. Today, looking back, we see in Operation __0_ not just a military success. This is a story of how horizontal connections and self-organization can resist vertical hierarchy and rigid force. It is a reminder that even in the most difficult conditions, when it seems that the enemy has an overwhelming superiority in technology and organization, the human spirit, multiplied by smart strategy, is capable of finding an asymmetric answer. Mentally returning to those autumn forests of '43, we no longer hear explosions. The smoke has cleared, the twisted metal has long been melted down, but the night silence with which we began our story is now filled with a different meaning. This is not the silence of fear or submission. This is the silence after the storm that cleared the horizon. The forest keeps its secrets, but the scars on the ground, where once ran the supply routes of one of the most fearsome armies in history, remind us of the price of victory, of how thousands of invisible conductors played their part in the greatest concert of liberation, silencing the enemy's guns, depriving them of shells. History tends to repeat itself in details, but its essence remains unchanged. Any system built on suppression is vulnerable if confronted by the united will of many. Rails can be restored, bridges rebuilt, but the broken spirit of an army that suddenly realized it had no safe rear cannot be restored. This is the main, eternal lesson of those distant events. The operation ended, but its resonance continues to vibrate in the fabric of history, reminding us of the power of unity and strategic thinking capable of overcoming any obstacles, even if they are made of steel and concrete. Here, at the final point of our narrative, we understand that every participant in those events, from a general in a Moscow office to a simple teenage scout in a Polesian village, was an indispensable note in this complex score. Remove one, and the melody of victory might have sounded different, weaker, or not sounded at all at that decisive moment. The memory of this is our duty, and understanding the mechanisms of that struggle is our lesson for the future. For true history is written not only with ink in documents, but also by the actions of people willing to step into the darkness to hasten the dawn. We leave this story not as a completed archive folder, but as a living testament to human capabilities. Capabilities to overcome the impossible, to find resources where there are none, and to win not by numbers, but by the ability to combine disparate efforts into a single crushing blow. And let trains today peacefully clatter their wheels along the same routes. In this rhythmic clatter, if you listen closely, you can always discern the echoes of that distant, fiery concert that changed the world. The Great Confrontation on the Rails became a classic example of what military science calls the isolation of the battlefield. Yet no textbook can convey the tension that hung in the air that autumn. German engineers, proud of their technical school, faced a problem that had no technical solution. They invented special hooks for destroying ties during retreat, so-called track destroyers. But they were not prepared for the tracks to be destroyed in front of their advancing or defending troops with such intensity. It was a paradox. An army that had perfected the art of blitzkrieg and logistics found itself a hostage to its own dependence on these logistical lines. The partisans, often lacking professional military education, intuitively and under central guidance, discovered this Achilles heel. They turned geography, vast forests, swamps, difficult terrain, into their ally. A railway, being a linear object, requires linear protection. It is impossible to protect a line of infinite length if the surrounding space is hostile. The Germans tried to concentrate forces at junction stations, turning them into fortresses. The partisans responded by striking at the interstation sections, the most vulnerable points between stations. It was an endless game of cat and mouse, where the roles of cat and mouse constantly shifted. It is also worth noting how the tactics of the demolitions themselves changed. While at the beginning of the war, these were often isolated, daring sorties, by 1943, it had become a science. Special methods for planting charges were developed to inflict maximum damage that was most difficult to repair. Explosions occurred on curves, on embankments, on bridges over small streams. The goal was not simply to damage a rail, it could be replaced in a couple of hours. The goal was to derail a train so that it would destroy the track for hundreds of meters, blocking traffic for a day or two. Twisted wagons, tangled in a pile of metal, became a barricade for subsequent trains. Now imagine the scale. Almost 150,000 rails were destroyed by partisans during the _quote_1_. If these rails were laid in a single line, it would stretch for many hundreds of kilometers. This is a colossal amount of metal, labor, and energy removed from the enemy's war potential. German industry, working at its limit, was forced to divert resources to the production of rails instead of tanks, to send labor battalions to the east instead of reinforcing combat units. The economic damage was comparable to the results of massive bombings of industrial centers. But let's return to the people. For behind every explosion lay someone's personal story. A story of overcoming fear. A story of waiting in ambush in freezing rain. A story of returning to camp with victory, or with the loss of comrades. In partisan detachments, men and women, old people and teenagers fought side by side. War erased social and age boundaries, leaving only one criterion: readiness to act. Operation Concert became the pinnacle of this consolidation. Never before had disparate groups of people, hundreds of kilometers apart, without mobile communication or the internet, acted so synchronously. The only link was radiograms, encrypted messages flying through the air. Start on the 19th, time 00, and they started. This synchronicity frightened the enemy more than the explosions themselves. It indicated that they were not fighting a gang, but a state. A state that, even having lost territory, maintained control and the will to resist on that land. This undermined the morale of the occupiers. A Wehrmacht soldier sitting in a trench on the banks of the Dnieper knew that behind him was not a reliable rear, but a boiling cauldron. Letters from home did not arrive, leaves were cancelled because trains were not running. The feeling of isolation grew with each passing day. And this feeling was as much a weapon as the Soviet Katyushas on the other side of the river. It is also interesting that the Soviet command was able to adjust plans in real time. When it became clear that there was not enough explosives, the emphasis shifted to destroying the railway tracks themselves, and not just the echelons. It was calculated that delaying movement for a certain time provides the same strategic effect as destroying a train. If a division does not arrive by the beginning of a battle, it does not participate in the battle. It exists, but it is not where it is needed. This is the philosophy of a new type of warfare, a war of timings and logistical disruptions. Partisans bought time for the Red Army, and this time was paid for by their risk and labor. By mid-October, when the Battle of the Dnieper was in full swing, the German railway network in the east resembled a sieve. Attempts to use road transport on roads softened by autumn rains only led to equipment sinking in the mud and consuming precious fuel, which was already in short supply. The circle closed. Nature, people, and strategy united against the invaders. Subsequently, historians will long argue about the details, refine the figures, and analyze the effectiveness of individual brigades. But the overall picture will remain unchanged. It was a triumph of coordination, a unique case in world history, when the partisan movement was fully integrated into the strategic plan of a regular army of such a scale. Usually, partisans act locally, based on their capabilities. Here, their capabilities were subordinated to a global goal. This required the highest trust between the center and the commanders on the ground. The center trusted the partisans to carry out the task, and the partisans believed that their efforts were not in vain, and that the greater land would not abandon them. Concluding this in-depth analysis, we must once again emphasize, Operation Concert is not just a page in a history textbook. It is a matrix of successful resistance. It teaches that even the most powerful technological systems are vulnerable if their critical points are found. In this case, the critical point was the rails, a seemingly simple thing, but on which the entire power of the war machine rested. A blow to this point led to a systemic failure. And today, when we look at maps where communication routes are marked, we understand how fragile our world is, dependent on logistics. One disruption in the supply chain can stop factories on the other side of the world. The partisans of 43 intuitively understood this principle of global connectivity long before the advent of systems theory. They acted crudely, with TNT and crowbars, but the result was surgically precise from a strategic point of view. May the memory of those events be not just a tribute to our ancestors, but also a source of wisdom. Wisdom to see the essence of things, to find unconventional solutions, and never to give up in the face of superior force. Because strength is not just the number of tanks or soldiers. Strength is the ability to manage chaos and direct its energy to achieve a goal. And in this art, the participants of Operation Concert were true virtuosos, performing their part flawlessly, leaving us a legacy of free land and an eternal example of courage and intellect. Every time you travel by train through the forests of Belarus or Ukraine, look out the window. There, among the trees, the spirit of those nights still hovers. And if you are attentive enough, you can feel that very vibration of determination that once made the earth itself tremble to save it from enslavement. This story lives in us, in our genetic memory, reminding us that there are no hopeless situations. There are only challenges to which we must find a worthy answer.